Hello and welcome to a new installment of Minds Between Languages. Today is joining us Professor Sandra Halverson, who will discuss with us default translation and why default translation is not literal translation.
Hi, Sandra. Welcome to Minds Between Languages. It's really nice to have you, really good to have you here.
Thank you so much, Anna-Katrina. It's really a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
Great, and we appreciate really to have you because you've been working on so interesting topics also lately. And yeah, I know that because I've been there. I've been at a presentation. So because you mentioned in that presentation, that talk, you mentioned, you referred to an observation actually, where in a way you observed translators, or I mean, it was more like an observation that was mentioned in our research community, maybe more broadly also, that sometimes translators seem to produce text without any effort, and then sometimes it seems to really cause a lot of effort. Can you tell us a little bit more about this observation?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you hinted, this is an observation that's been around in translation studies for as long as we've been interested in translation processes. And so it's figured in various guises over the years, and it occurs amongst others in sort of as part of the Tyrken and Condit's monitor model, which we know from the early 2000s. And from the very, very early studies using keystroke logging technologies, it's been observed that I think Antlikke Jacobsen saw quite early on that there's a temporal contour to translation that shows sort of an ebb and a flow, that there are fluent passages and less fluent passages. And this has been captured by a number of different constructs, among others, like I said, the monitor model, but also Karl and Dragstedt, for instance, referred to default and challenged translation productions. Kirsten Malmscher has referred to a sort of first translational response. Yeah, so it's an idea that's been around. It also figures in this idea of sort of production bursts, if you will. Also figures in cognitive writing research. So it's an idea that's been around for a while, and the reason why it interested me was because I was quite interested in thinking a little bit about what kinds of theories might be able to account for some of the patterns that we find. And that was kind of what my starting point was.
There's also a lot of terms around. Another term kind of just pops in my mind now is literal translation.
Yes.
What's actually all those differences?
No, you're absolutely right. And I think one of the reasons why the idea of literal translation occurs to so many people in this context is because there's been a kind of both an assumption, a relatively, old assumption that literal translation, and by literal, I mean, and people have meant up to and including the present, translation that is more or less word for word, right? So that you go word by word by word by word, and that is somehow referred to as literal translation. And when this notion, or the desire to explain why some kinds of translation may be easier than others came into translation process research, Tyrken and Condit's monitor model referred to stretches of relatively unchallenged or easy production using the monitor model. And she said that translators just translate literally, that is word for word, until they encounter a problem, and then they stop and do something different. So this idea of literalness was brought into translation process research, I think, at least by her, if not others also.
But it's different, actually.
Yes, it is. It is different. I mean, the idea of the Tyrken and Condit's monitor model and the work by Schaefer and Karl, among others, who have made use of her model, has this idea that there's some sort of structural similarity or a formal similarity that makes translation easier, and that is kind of the starting point for translation processes,
Yeah.
right? Whereas while I recognize that, of course, I mean, that may play into it at some part along the way, the idea of default translation is not that it's formal similarity of any kind that makes it easier. It's just that some translation pairs or solutions or correspondences between source and target languages are learned, and they become routinized choices, and then that they are stored as such and are more easily and readily available for the translator as they move along.
I see. Something like a a dictionary of expressions that you can access quite easily without
Yes,
it being really a literal translation.
yes, it could be a sort of a formal correspondent, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. I mean, in principle, we could even imagine that there would be default translations where the translation would be a zero, right? We learn, for instance, if we translate between a language that has extensive use of honorifics, for example, esteemed so and so, that in translation to another language it doesn't have that particular usage pattern, that we would leave them out, right? And so the default there would be zero. Right. So,
Yeah.
so the default idea that I would argue for is based on learning and instruction and a record of the kinds of translational decisions that you have made that are stored and are readily available for you.
Right. So is this something you can find in any translated document actually, or is it more specific to some text types or?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There are a couple of things that maybe I could address here. First of all, I was kind of in the original presentations of this idea, I was kind of orthodox in saying that these can only be identified in process data. You can, because you are wanting to identify uninterrupted or relatively fluent passages. Of course, you can also, I think I'd be a little bit less rigid about that and say that, okay, yes, we also can identify um, the outcomes of those processes in translational products, though I wouldn't be satisfied to say that we can only identify those in product data. It would have to somehow be linked with process data. But in principle, yes, any translator who has any kind of translation experience at all will produce default translations. And the idea would be that the more experienced you are, the more you would be able to translate in that default mode. And by experience, I don't just mean quantity. I also would say it has to do with your experience and familiarity with particular types of translation, whether it would be a text type or, some sort of subject domain or what have you. But there would be a correlation between the translator's experience and familiarity with the task and the amount of default processing that would be involved in that case.
Is it, I mean, you could now wonder, is it actually a good thing or is it rather a bad thing?
That's a really good question, actually. I don't know how this discussion started, but at some point in translation process research, there was reference to this construct from cognitive psychology of functional fixedness, which is the idea that you get sort of stuck in a rut, right? You have one solution to this problem, and that's your go-to solution, and you always use that, whether it's appropriate or not. And I think that is an analog to this idea of default translations that sometimes, or default processing, that it can be helpful to you if you are in a situation where you're under time pressure or for whatever kind of constraint may be impacting your processing. But yeah, I think there's a certain risk that that translators may overuse. Overuse would of course be some sort of a normative judgment, but that it becomes a sort of a fixed solution or a pat solution to a translational question. Yeah, definitely. It doesn't necessarily have to be a good thing.
I mean, you could also think about it as a strategy, right? So maybe there's a strategy when some specific factors are combined, and maybe also you could switch your strategy and then use a different translation style. Are
Yeah.
there specific conditions under which translators are more, where they tend to produce more default translation than other? You mentioned time pressure, for instance, but are there different factors also?
Yeah, I think I would think that the more pressure, whatever that kind of pressure would be, whether it was a time constraint or whether it was some other sort of environmental constraint that was um, pertinent in a given task setting, that would perhaps correlate with more use of default processes. Also, I mean, it might also be the case that novices, when looking for, they're unable to actually decide what or even generate any number of alternatives. They could just go for something that they thought would be the closest best first alternative, which would be a default, right? So that would be kind of a counter argument to the correlation between experience and default translations, right? Because we would expect more default translations the more experienced you are. But I think at the other end, I mean, this is an empirical question, of course, that the more novice you are, you may have a smaller set of defaults, but you maybe use them more often. I don't know. That would be an interesting empirical question.
So, and then if I follow up on your thought, and maybe experience would be kind of to have a large set of default translation that you can produce easily.
That would be the hypothesis anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any evidence on that? Any observation that you made, maybe?
Yeah, I did a couple of pilot studies with Ricardo Munoz on this right before the pandemic, and we compared. We had Spanish students of translation and Norwegian students of translation translate the same texts into English, and we did a couple of sort of things with that data. And there was quite a large difference in the amount of experience the two groups had. We haven't published those results, but it was quite evident in the initial analyses that we did that the amount of default processing that seemed to be occurring in the more advanced students was greater than the amount that we had in our quite novice students. Like I said, we haven't published those results, and we would probably want to redo that or do another larger study to actually demonstrate that with any plausibility, with any sort of reliability. But I think it was an interesting observation that we made even in those initial stages.
How do you find those default translations? I mean, what kind of data are you actually studying or exploring to observe this?
Yeah, I think well, there are several answers to that question. I mean, if you look at the study by Carl and Drogstedt from 2012, where they were looking at what they referred to as default versus challenge translations, they looked at eye tracking data and they looked at keystroke logs, right? And they brought those together and used progression graphs to demonstrate that. And the idea about the eye tracking data would be looking at the reading behavior, where the translators read, and with in their analyses, in this sort of unchallenged mode, there was a pretty not fixed but regular or what can I say, constant rate of reading ahead, which was a demonstration they claimed of that. Personally, I haven't used eye tracking data, but I'm in the process of developing several analyses using that data that we collected back in the day with Ricardo and his team in Italy. And we're analyzing the keystroke logs. Now, if you're looking for this in keystroke data, there are a couple of things you can do, or a couple of different approaches you can take to that data. So you can either say, okay, on the basis of my theory, I am going to define, I'm going to look at these data, the keystroke logs, and define defaults according to these process-based characteristics. For instance, speed of production, or length of preceding pause, or things like that. We're actually taking a rather different approach, and trying to develop a process-based method. And what we're doing is we've actually started from the product end, in the sense that we have made an assumption that translators, even novice translators, will converge on translations on the basis of sort of their experience with the languages that they're working with and their experience in translation. So depending on the kinds of structures that you're working with, there's a pretty good chance that a set of these will be shared. It will be a smaller set than the set of say my default translations. My set of default translations will be much larger than the set that overlaps with 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 other translators. But we're using that convergence criterion. We have looked at using the translation segmentation framework developed by Munoz and Affel, among others. We have segmented the texts. We have used that convergence criterion to distinguish segments with defaults from segments without, and then we're looking to see what process-based criteria correlate with the segments that have defaults and the segments that don't. So we have 2 papers in process on that, where we actually investigate, using that sort of initial convergence criterion, what kind of process-based characteristics can we use? And then through statistical analysis, we're trying to come up with a statistical method for identifying the segments that have defaults in them in keystroke data. So that's how we're going about it anyway.
So you're doing actually kind of a reverse engineering.
Yes, in a sense we are. And hopefully it's kind of method development actually. And we're thinking if we could devise a method whereby these kinds of default sort of segments that have defaults in them can be identified in the data without having identified these on any other basis than the process-based data, then we'll be able to say, look, ask all sorts of questions about those segments or the defaults within the segments that we are interested in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it might also help you then maybe to identify defaults that maybe you couldn't see before because you didn't have the process data.
Yeah,
You will
exactly.
discover it will be like a treasure hunt in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And the method that we're developing, then we're going to try that on a new data set to see, exactly whether the features of what we saw in these product-based defaults are actually the same as come out when we start from the other angle, right? So we're coming at it from this angle, and then we're going to come at it from this angle and see whether we actually get the same kinds of structures.
Can you use corpus methods also to look maybe for n-grams or something like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, one of the sort of hypotheses that would come out of something like this is that you would expect, like our convergence criterion, we say, look, there are going to be a set of these kinds of defaults that are common because of the relationships between the languages involved, because of the frequency of the structures or items involved, that translators in working in this language pair are going to tend to do the same sorts of things. Also, as an effective training, for instance, right? They will have been taught to do X, Y, or Z. And so those kinds of things may show up in a corpus as frequent translation solutions. And it's interesting that you asked because that's kind of where I started from. My interest from this was this idea of, features of translated text that are can be used to discriminate translated text from non-translated text. And one of the features that shows up, for instance, in these machine learning studies that have come out is that frequency matters, right? Of course, so highly frequent items tend to be more frequent in translated text than in non-translated text. So I'm thinking, and since the notion of default translation is also a frequency-based notion, it seemed to me like that would be a way of trying to explain some of the patterns that we find in corpus data as well.
But this is not what you don't know yet, right? If I understand you correctly. So you have different observations, but they're not connected, right?
That's exactly right.
Right now.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
This is very fascinating. I'm really looking forward for the results.
Yeah, me too.
So then maybe you have even a hunch about, because you mentioned machine translation also just very briefly, but do you think there's a difference between human translated text and machine translated text in terms of, I mean, maybe the notion of default translation doesn't work so well with machines, or maybe it does, right? Depending on the database they have, they might use some translations more frequently than others, or.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, because default translation in a sense is a frequency-based notion, right? But it's based on the kinds of statistical learning that humans do, right? So humans learn and then they routinize solutions to problems, right? And we know that machine learning based translation systems also are pattern detection mechanisms, right? So they look for frequencies of patterns. It's a very good question because you would expect that machine translated text would, in a sense, show that kind of pattern that is, the more frequent items would show up and the less frequent items would not, and that kind of thing. But that would be an empirical question, right? To see whether you would find more highly frequent structures in machine translated text. And of course, it would have to be related to the training data, right? As we know.
And it would be a highly relevant question too, right? Because that might also tell us whether in a couple of years, maybe we may find only certain words or certain structures in a text and not others anymore. So
yeah, you're
our
absolutely
language is changing with machine translation.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I think that's some of the sort of anecdotal things that you read in the media about about generative AI will tell you that that's some of the findings of, analyses of that kind of text that's produced will show you that kind of thing, right? That it's very sort of conventional, right? Highly conventional language.
Regressed towards mean, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So I don't know whether you had a look at interpreters too, right? I mean, since I have interpreter training, I'm always very interested into interpreting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what I find interesting also about interpreting in this respect is that, in a way, what you produce in interpreting is the first draft, right? You don't work over it. So you really have the process and product data in a way is the same, you could say. So what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think that's a really good question, and one that I really, really would like to look at recordings of interpreters to look at this particular kind of thing as well, because like you said, I mean, product and process are more or less the same. It's the same production, right? The same language production, and at the same time, it is an extreme production situation where time constraints and are of, they're way different than they are for translators, and that will clearly have an impact on the choices that translators make. And if you look at the literature in interpreting training, or in interpreting studies, which I'm sure you know very, very well, there's a lot of concern with this question of strategies and selection and having a set of prefabricated translations to use as a way of reducing cognitive load, right? So it's a concern that's also been around for a long time in interpreting studies, and I think even I've been told by interpreters that they are taught to develop a set of those, sort of ready to go, right? So what would be interesting, I think it would be really interesting to see, I mean, to perhaps compare the amount of production that could be classified as sort of happening in a default mode in interpreting versus translation, right? You could do that. And also to look at the linguistic characteristics of the default structures that are used by interpreters versus translators. I think there would be a whole slew of really interesting questions you could ask, and using a comparative method of investigation, really.
I would be, in a sense, actually applying a method of translation research, translation process research to interpreting. That would be super fascinating to do, yeah.
Yeah, it really would. It really would. And I think there would be, all sorts of interesting questions that you could ask. I mean, like some of the ones that I mentioned, but also just that idea that interpreters are trained to use this strategy, whereas translators are not. In fact, it's with the small exception of, what to do with, very, very specific contrastive items.
And we've talked about translation interpreting, but this phenomenon of default translation, does it tell you maybe also something about language processing in general?
Yes, it does. And I think the way I'd like to answer that has to do with the whole sort of notion of entrenchment from cognitive linguistics, right? So cognitive linguistics is not the same as psycholinguistics, but there's a sort of a vein or there's an interface there where the notion of entrenchment is one of the notions that sort of straddles the boundary between cognitive linguistics and psychology and psycholinguistics. And the idea behind entrenchment is that repeated use strengthens memory representations, right? So that the more you use a linguistic item or structure, construction, whatever, the stronger your memory representation becomes, and the more easily available it is for you later on, right? So the idea that what makes translation and interpreting different from, say, monolingual production is, of course, that the idea is that these entrenchment, this sort of strengthening of a memory representation happens across languages rather than within languages, right? So I think investigating default translation would be able to tell us something about how this process operates across languages, but also specific to a very particular task, right? Either translation or interpreting, because these bilingual tasks are different from just regular bilingual language production, right? And that's also something that's very interesting and important for us to understand better what it is about the cognitive processes of translators and interpreters that makes them different from bilingual language producers in general, right? And I think an important part of that has to do with experience and learning on task. And that's why I think it would be really important to, the more of this kind of research that we could do and then compare it to the production of bilinguals who have no experience or training in either of these particular tasks to see what the actual development of this kind of particular bilingual expertise actually consists in.
What it adds actually to your cognitive processes, and where maybe also there are the similarities, right?
Absolutely.
Because in a way also I feel there are a lot of similarities. Yeah. So now, as you just said, you rely on so many different disciplines and techniques and methods actually to investigate for translation, but for your research just in general. How do you bring all of these topics and strains together actually?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question, and it's one that's, I guess I could answer in a number of different ways. I mean, when I started my training basically as a linguistically trained translation scholar, and became quite early on enamored of cognitive linguistics because of what I felt to be its power and its coherence as a philosophical and scientific program, and I have been very happy with that decision. However, it became quite clear also at some point that I couldn't really do what I wanted to do or talk about the kinds of phenomena that I wanted to talk about without also looking at psycholinguistic research, because you start moving into that area. And like I said, there are some concepts that straddle. Another concept, for instance, is this whole issue of representations. Now, cognitive grammar in some ways begs the question of what those representations might look like, while at the same time developing models that look very like representations in many respects. So it became clear to me that I just had to look at the various kinds of research and try and bring them together. And the way I have tried to do that is to try to look for approaches, theoretical frameworks that seem to share underlying assumptions about how language works. And that I thought was important because it's quite clear that in linguistics anyway, there are two pretty different camps of linguistics, right? There are formalists and there are functionalists. And I'm not so sure whether theoretical constructs from the one approach will work so well within the other, et cetera, et cetera. So I mean, that's one of the first things I had to look for, is approaches that seem to at least be building on an underlying conceptualization of language that would make them amenable to being combined. And the next step then, once you've identified work that you think will work along those lines, is to look for the actual constructs themselves, right? Which of these seem to be trying to do the same things? What makes them similar? What makes them different? Are other people bringing them together? If they can't be brought together, why or why not? And that kind of grappling with the actual concepts. And I've mentioned entrenchment. I've also mentioned the issue of, representations. So what about representations? Well, some models have sort of are based on a network type structure of spreading activation. That to me seemed to be an important characteristic of a number of models that allowed for a dialogue across disciplines. Another issue would be whether or not or how distinctions are made between the conceptual level of a representation and the formal level of a representation, because as we know, for translation, we have to be able to distinguish conceptualizations from forms because we are moving from one language to the other. So it seems to me that we have to have some way of handling those two parts of a representation. We can't just say representations in general. We have to be able to distinguish between what elements of a representation are important to us. Another issue that I found important in trying to bring these things together is this whole question of frequency and the impact of frequency and various types of frequency on language production. So from the basic underlying assumptions to the basic concepts that seem to be informing the models and the frameworks, and then just trying to sort of stitch things together to the best of my ability. I don't know whether I've always succeeded. It seems like every time you look really hard, you find places that
and something else, yeah.
Yeah, right. There's something missing, or it should be something else, or yeah. And I've done a fair amount of reading also sort of on multidisciplinarity as a concept in scientific research, and how people go about doing it, and what are the questions you should be asking, and how important is it? I mean, how do you actually combine concepts or bring concepts together across disciplines? And I think there are different views on that also, about how worried you should be or what to do with conceptual overlap or lack thereof. And so I don't think there's actually a right and a wrong way or one right and one wrong way of doing it. It's just a matter of trying to be careful and transparent and about how you do it, I guess.
It seems to me that often we're building bridges between languages, but often also between disciplines in a way, right? This is exactly what you just described and what you've been doing, right? Between cognitive linguistics and psycholinguistics, and then maybe translation process research, to bring all the things together, to stitch them together, as you said.
Yeah.
Kind of find a common ground also for discussion, maybe, in a way.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think what makes this, this is just the most recent iteration of what translation studies has always been. I mean, Mary Snell Hornby said in 1988 or 80 something that translation studies is an interdiscipline. And at that point, she was also referring to psychology and linguistics and what have you. And we've seen sort of these different iterations of different kinds of interdisciplinarity over time, with literary studies and cultural studies and post-colonial studies and media studies, and it's the nature of our object of study, I think, that makes
to
it
be in between.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah.
To build bridges. That's
yeah.
nice.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to talk to you. Fascinating to hear from your research, and I hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you, Anna-Katrina, and thank you again for the invitation. I've enjoyed it so much.
Thank you so much.